Thank you, Dr. Mendelson, and Dr. Schnare is next.
Thank you, Joe. I have become addicted to this, so I use it as my briefing now. If I check my email during my speech, please forgive me. I want to start out by saying to you the same thing that my wife requires me to say every time I speak publicly. I am only speaking on behalf of myself. And I rise on behalf of the American Tradition Institute and no other than the Thomas Jefferson Institute, whose name you'll see on these slides as well. I am a person who started out as an environmental scientist back in the 70s, in the early 70s, and I am part of a generation of scientists like Patrick Moore, who in his book, Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, at least in the first few chapters I recommend, you read them, the second half of the book's a little bit different, but it may not be interesting to many of you. But I do think people need to recognize that those of us who got into environmental practice in the early days, EPA was formed in 1970, we have not moved away from the environmental movement. The environmental activists have moved away from the core environmental issues. And when we look at the problems we face today, what we did back then is what we ought to be doing now, and that is put your feet on the ground. Back when I started with EPA, more people wore desert boots and common working clothes than you see today, which is more on the order of three-piece business suits and an attitude of well, I'm not going to go there. What I wanted to talk about today is something called none of the above. I want to start with something you've already seen. This is, actually you haven't seen this one, you'll see the next one. This is an examination of the IPCC's 1990 prediction on what was going to happen to the temperature over the period of time from 1990 on. And the blue and green lines are two different independent temperature records that show that we're beyond the 95, we're below the 95% confidence interval of the IPCC projections. Clearly their projections are wrong. What's fascinating to me, and I think you've seen this before, I don't know what direction I need to point this at to make it go forward. Yeah, it's the top one, right? Yeah, well. Can someone push this forward for me? All right, I'm sorry, I was going. Let's get back to where I was. That one. This is a chart you've seen in one form or another already today, but what's important here is that this actually comes from GISS itself. This is Gavin Schmidt's chart. The top grayish line is scenario A. You've heard Pat Michaels talk about. That's the how things, that's the do nothing scenario, and the colored lines are again the two independent prediction or actual measurements. And they reflect what Hansen said was going to happen if we stopped all carbon emissions immediately. So it's in the context of just how bad the predictions have been that we need, I think, to recognize that until there's a consensus that the models and predictions are wrong, there remains the opportunity for politicians to take a different view. And right now, their view is about energy and the concept, well, we'll do all of the above. Why do all of the above? Well, because it gives everybody an opportunity to participate. You don't have to be opposed to anything. You can just say, hey, all of the above. And, of course, it provides considerable rent sinking by politicians who are running for office. Now, in reality, it's just a canard. It perpetuates the arguments, the extreme arguments, and it ignores both science and economics, as we've already heard today. Here's the philosophical thing I think you need to appreciate. Energy is a sin, or energy is the master resource. Those are sort of your choices. There really aren't many others, and it's this philosophical divide that no one wants to talk about much, but you ought to realize which side you're on and accept that notion and argue from that point. This is all of the above. It's a nice pie chart, and you'll notice the sort of ugly green. Those of us who are in the environment recognize there are different shades of green. But that green in the pie is the renewable section of the primary energy production. And the bar, the vertical bar then, is that, how that breaks out, most of which, by the way, you'll notice is biomass, but 1% of the total is wind, and solar is 1/10 of that. And I want to key for a little bit on the fact that we aren't exactly supporting all the energy sources at the same time. What we're really doing is, and Sierra Club makes this point very clearly, we just want to get rid of coal. We just want to shut it down. I will share with you a very quick story. A woman came up to me after I had made a speech, and she said, "We have to get rid of coal." And this is one of those you recognize immediately, and so you just agree with them. And I went, "You bet. What shall we use in its place?" And she went, "Electricity." We are subsidizing the renewables at a rate far, far in excess of what we're subsidizing the others. We're subsidizing everything. I am one of those who believes we should subsidize none of them and let the market have its way. But just so you know, there are the numbers. You've seen this chart just a few minutes ago, but this is a simplified version. This is the Energy Information Administration's 2016 cost for building plants. I just want to point out, in the old days, let's put it this way. An engineer and an economist were stranded on a desert island with nothing more than a big box of canned beans. And the question was, how are they going to survive? And the engineer, of course, he got out rocks, he started fires, he did all kinds of physical things to try to open these cans. And the economist sat back and was watching all this. And eventually the engineer looked at him and said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" And he said, "Well, first I'm going to postulate that we have a can opener." It's those postulates that are important. And I apologize to my economist friends. I started out with the agency doing economic analysis, so it's on me too. If you look at the two things that are circled, you'll notice that wind energy is they tried to make wind energy onshore equivalent to conventional coal. To do this, they had to do two things. They had to assume a $15 per ton carbon tax. This is your federal government saying we're going to assume that. This was after the House had already destroyed cap and trade and said we're not going there, and there's not going to be a carbon tax. And so we begin by a disconnection with reality, and then we go to the wind and the assumptions on wind, and they said, gee, it's going to work 34% of the time. Well, it doesn't, and I'll show you that it doesn't in a second, but that's what it takes. If you use the actual productive capacity of wind, it's not equivalent at all. It's $290 per kilowatt hour construction cost, and that's a whole lot more. That's more than double, almost triple the cost of coal. And of course, you see offshore wind is really bad. As an environmentalist, I can't help but say, I love the energy from hydro dams, but I sort of like the fish that were in the stream that aren't there anymore as well. And that's the challenge. The challenge you're going to be seeing over the next couple decades are environmentalists against environmentalists. It's already happening. Let me talk about wind and get to it directly. I believe we need to put wind on trial. We're doing that from the American Traditions Institute in Colorado now. Wind is variable. This is wind over just a period of 270 minutes, and where you see the wind varying going down, it has to be backfilled, because on an electric grid, you must have supply and demand exactly the same all the time, frequency and voltage. You really don't have any freedom to do otherwise. Or equipment breaks, it falls offline. Big equipment, little equipment, brownouts of 1/10 of a second will shut down a plant that doesn't have adequate instant protection on it. And one of the plants that will shut down are coal-fired power plants, which is a real problem. So you can get brownout problems. They cost billions of dollars a year, and you hardly even know it, and you don't see it in your pocket, but business does. Wind exacerbates this, and the problem you have is, well, gee, if you're going to have this much variation in wind, you have to have something to back it up, to fill in for it, and that's fossil fuel. Now, it can be natural gas, but we're seeing studies done where they're actually using coal for a variety of reasons, mainly because it saves money for the electric companies. And the problem is that it creates more pollution than it prevents. This is data from Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and this is 60 different wind farms, over 1,000 windmills. And even in that case where you would think, well, with all these windmills, maybe things will balance themselves out, they do not. This is a large area. Some people don't think of Ireland as large, but for a wind farm it is. And meteorologically it's significant. Different parts of Ireland are very different from other parts. And yet, as you see in the bottom graph, that's just 1 month. You can actually see the tick marks for the days. You can have variations on the left-hand side. It's megawatts. You can see increases and decreases of 100, 200, 300, 500 megawatts in a period of a minute or two. And it is this ratcheting up and down of the fossil fuel plants that causes a problem, because it's like a car driving in urban traffic. You get much poorer mileage than if you just let it drive at a constant pace. In fact, studies have shown that you use so much more fuel ratcheting up and down, and your pollution control works so much more poorly when you see these variations, that if you had just put the fossil fuel plant on the line and taken the wind off, you would have had less pollution than if you had the wind power on and you had to follow it with your fossil fuel. And so what you end up with is a rush to wind, which even T. Boone Pickens admits is no longer a good idea. Of course, he owns all that gas out there. But even he has realized, okay, he could have sold the gas to back it up, but to heck with that, let's just sell the gas and run gas plants. And in the rush to do this, remember, it's only 1% of the energy today. There is no way you can get to an 80% reduction in coal. And so what does it mean if you're an all of the above person? Are you boots on the ground or not? Well, I don't think you are. In essence, all of the above embraces the radical environmental agenda because it costs more, and people who support it, politicians who stand up and say, well, I'm with all of the above, by force of logic, must reject fundamental economic theory, free markets, property rights, and this is what offends me most. Those people least able to pay for the increases are the ones who are most harmed. They are harmed at the pocketbook. They are harmed in terms of environmental quality. They're harmed in terms of public health. Now, one of the things we've had the pleasure of doing with the American Tradition Institute is working with Beacon Hill and Professor Turek. And in his national report, which we helped fund and which we helped distribute on RPS, on Renewable Portfolio Standards, we added a little section that they kindly put on my request, and then properly footnoted me as saying, we didn't do it, he did it, which is fine. But what we did is we did something that at EPA we used to do for years, we don't do anymore, and that is we looked at the health wealth literature and we looked at what the cost to the citizen was, the lost revenue, the revenue stream came out of your pocketbooks, and we said, what does that mean in terms of health? Because if you have less money, you don't go to the doctor as often. And there's a fairly well-known relationship about that. And we added in how many people would perish prematurely as a result of these kinds of all of the above renewables approaches. And it isn't a small number. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's up on our website. It's up on the Beacon Hill website, and you can find that. And I think that's what's lost. We are sacrificing human life on the altar of political expediency. And it is that which is the spin-off of the concern over climate change, which in and of itself is certainly on uncertain foundations. I think the public is finally getting a handle around this. For the first time since 1984, Gallup reports that when people were asked to rank things, they rank, I don't use the word prioritize because my wife doesn't believe we should use words that don't really exist. And I do, I assure you, everything my wife tells me. The public has basically said we are prepared now at this time to rank economic growth over the environment, even if the environment suffers to some extent. And that is because, and I'm going to end where I began, when we started back in the 70s, rivers were on fire. The pollution was so bad in the air that people could literally fall dead in the street. Children were harmed. The elderly, especially the ill elderly, could not survive in those kinds of conditions well. And the result over 40 years of environmental effort is that isn't true anymore. We've come a very long way. Take a look at what Steve Hayward puts out annually on how far we've come. And the reality is we've solved the vast majority of the hard problems in the environment, and we're now dealing with the last little bit, and anyone who's had a basic course in economics knows that first 80% only costs 20% of what it would be to get rid of it all. That last 20% costs as much as the first 80% did. And it is that people are saying is too much. There are other important things that we have in our life, and that is the message that all of the above ignores. Thank you.